If becoming a vegan ever sounded to you like a joyless task, like you'd have to give up too much, that you'd miss meat too much, or that you'd have to transform into an entirely different person, Matt Halteman has some advice.
The destination of this journey is an inviting, empowering, and inclusive understanding of everyday vegan living that abandons the demoralizing goal of arriving once and for all at a perfected individual identity in favor of inspired but practical striving toward a global aspiration. To do what one enthusiastically can, within one's limits and always imperfectly, to live toward a truer, more beautiful, better vegan world. Instead of framing our individual efforts to go vegan unrealistically in terms of the achievement of a one-size-fits-all state of being, a so-called cruelty-free identity, we'll envision going vegan as a liberating journey of becoming that unfolds uniquely for every person based on what their individual and communal situations inspire and enable them to contribute.
I'm Jerusha Klemperer, and this is What You're Eating, a project of foodprint.org. We aim to help you understand how your food gets to your plate and to see the full impact of the food system on animals, planet, and people. We uncover the problems with the industrial food system and offer examples of more sustainable practices, as well as practical advice for how you can help support a better system through the food that you buy and the system changes you push for.
I'm Matt Halteman. I'm a philosophy professor. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Grew up in the Midwest, come from agriculture on both sides. As a philosopher, got sort of interested in critical reflection on foodways that had always just been sort of taken for granted. And that opened for me a brand new way, not just of thinking about who I am and what I want and what my deepest values are and what my aspirations should be, but really kind of unfolded this new way of thinking about the complexity of my inner life, because it wasn't just about my intellectual commitments. It was about my emotional states and about my social relationships and about my physical body in a lot of cases when we're talking about food, right? We're organisms. We're putting other organisms or former organisms in our bodies. And so, yeah, I'm a philosophy professor transformed by these crazy, interesting questions about food that lead into all corners of our inner lives and, of course, from soil to stratosphere in the world outside.
I was wondering if you could just touch on that a little bit about this kind of moment in academia and in philosophy in particular, where there's been a space carved out to engage with this question of animal ethics and what we eat.
One of the things that I love about philosophy is that it's not just about thinking, it's about living, it's about being in a certain way. So philosophy is the lived pursuit of wisdom in our everyday affairs, or the love of wisdom, right, as the ancients said. And philosophers get really excited when we discover a phenomenon from everyday experience that is sort of pervasively influential in our lives, but really hard to reflect on. And I think food is sort of, one of the most basic things in our lives. And for that reason, it's one of the most invisible things in our lives. And moreover, as I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, it kind of cuts across our inner landscape in these really fascinating ways, because we're physical organisms, so we need to take in calories, and we're emotional creatures, and so we have feelings about the things we're eating. And so grandma's cream cheese cookies make us feel a completely different way than somebody else's aunt's brownies, right? Even though it's all sugar and butter and etc. Similarly, socially, right? We have these friendships and social relationships and food ways that are kind of deeply built into those. And so it's risky to eat differently than your people eat, or to suggest that you want to go to a restaurant that is coded in a way that your people don't love, right? And so this is the perfect place for philosophy to meet daily life where the rubber hits the road, right? Because here's this phenomenon that we're all doing 3 times a day, 4 times a day. If you're me, 5, 6, 7 times a day, right? We love to eat. And most of us haven't given even a stray thought to why we're putting these particular foods in our bodies, whether we should be putting those or other foods in our bodies. And moreover, because it's so interwoven into who we are, it's really difficult to be reflective about it. We don't get too many chances to reflect. And if we do, they're kind of unwelcome, right? Because nobody wants to look under the hood of what's going on at the farms where the food is produced, or what the conditions that the workers have to put up with. We want to eat our steak and leave those more complex narratives to the side. And so that is just a ripe opportunity for people who are, interested in living an examined life to dig in. And I think that's part of the reason that food ethics classes, food systems transformation, animal ethics have become such popular courses on universities, because it's a way to take a systemic look, right, at something fundamental to our flourishing that affects every last thing we do, everything we are on the inside, and then how much topsoil we have, what our workers are treated like, how much arable land is left, how much water we're going to be able to use moving forward, whether we're going to be able to feed the world by 2050, right? These are the biggest questions facing humankind and the entire planet. And by looking at what we eat, we can confront some of the most, basic and fundamental questions. So that philosophers love this, right? Because it's just a fascinating confluence of deep-seated, mysterious, existential things that make us who we are, and massive impact in the world outside. And that's an irresistible combination for a philosopher.
And we're going to come back to this question of identity and how what we eat is really tied into who we think of ourselves as in this world. But I wanted to start with your book. So you've written a book. Tell us the title of the book. Tell us a little bit what it's about. I'm just going to say the title and the intro, they're really sort of luscious and frothy.
Yeah, so the book is called Hungry, Beautiful Animals: The Joyful Case for Going Vegan. And, the elevator pitch is everybody knows what vegans are against, but what are vegans for, right? Like, why do vegans take a stand against some of these things that nobody wants to learn about their food? And what I'm trying to do in this book is really to pivot from this burdensome, scarcity-driven, obligation-focused way of thinking about what it means to go vegan, to seeing going vegan as a joyful opportunity to live more fully and authentically into values that we already hold, right? I mean, I think two big things that I want people to take away from this book is you're probably a vegan in waiting, right? You probably have all the beliefs, all the feelings, all the moral commitments that you need to find the vision of a vegan world incredibly compelling. Now, that would have surprised me at age 28 when I first started learning about these issues. It certainly didn't seem to fit. But when I think you do the work, it's fascinating how many people come to see, wow, right? Going vegan isn't going to make me a radically different person. It's actually going to help me become who I thought I already was, right? And that's the biggest sort of eyebrow raiser, right? In this stuff, for me at least, is that I thought it was going to require this radical break, right, from who I've always been. I have to, refute all of the things that I used to be, and kick all those things to the curb and become someone radically new. And instead, it was just a matter of extending the scope of beliefs and commitments and aspirations I already held. And so this is a book about, in a narrative way, trying to bring people into that journey, demystify it a little bit, and emphasize the degree to which, man, this is really about opportunity, not about obligation. I mean, maybe it turns out we're obligated to, and a lot of wonderful philosophers and critical theorists and sociologists and others have made arguments that maybe moral obligation is the right way to think about this. But even if that's true, it seems to me, there's another perspective by which, obligated or not, there's so much opportunity here, right? To be the change we want to see in the world with this one fairly simple interaction that allows us to live incredibly fully into aspirations that we already have, even if we haven't made those connections just yet.
I mentioned the intro sets the stage for, if this is something your mind is open to doing, this book and I are here to help you with this potential transformation or extension of your essential self, if you want to look at it that way. I thought it sounded, I mean this in a good way, it sounded very evangelical to me, kind of like there is a conversion that's possible here, a kind of transformation or conversion that's full of possibility and that will make your life better. And I got kind of amped up in that way that I feel like you might, during a church service that's like really calling you to. Is that vibe intentional? Is that accidental?
That is such a complicated question to ask to a guy from Wheaton, Illinois, right? But I love this question because it gives me a chance to make it very clear, why that feeling is there, but also what I'm not trying to do there, right? So I would say it is evangelical in the sort of literal sense of the Greek. I do think there's good news here. There's really good news, right? This thing that you've heard was burdensome. This thing that you probably ought to take a harder look at, but you're dreading. This thing that you think is going to estrange you from all these things that are important to you is in fact this thing that can help you get more of what you've always wanted. That is really good news, right? So in that respect, there is an evangel, right? There is a bit of good news. I hope to avoid, like the plague, being evangelical in the sense of coming and colonizing another person's experience with my version, right, of the good life. That version of evangelical, which at least for me, growing up where I did and being adjacent to certain forms of kind of Protestant Christianity. I mean, I have a lot of good experiences with Protestant Christianity as well, but in Wheaton, Illinois, you get a lot of opportunity to be told what you need to do or otherwise go to hell, right? And so I really hope that evangelical frothiness you felt is more in the register of that. Wow, this is good transformational news. There's joy, right, down this path that I wasn't expecting to experience versus, now I have to play by this colonizer's rules, right, or else. That I hope to avoid assiduously.
You definitely avoided that. And that distinction is really helpful. It seems that you're affirming for the reader that we can continue to be ourselves. And as you said, maybe our best selves, the self we always thought we were. You said, for most of us, consuming animal products is a practice so deeply entrenched in the ways we embody and express identity that eating these foods is like breathing air or speaking our native language. And how that connection to eating meat, if that's the tradition we come from, makes it hard for a lot of us to conceive of or complete the practice of giving up eating animal products. And that, I love this too, that visions for change are more compelling when they include visions of continuity. Can you tell us more about what that means?
You're speaking of chapters 2 and 3 in the book, and this really important transition that I try to make between honoring the fact that making a transition like this is incredibly hard, right? But one of the things that really galls me, and I've been guilty of actually sort of trying this myself, and it's always failed, but when you sort of trivialize how hard it is to change eating habits, like, haven't you seen that there are Gardein patties in the freezer section? Like, this is easy, and it's like, when you act as though something as fundamental as changing food ways is easy, it seems to me either you're lying about your own experience or you're woefully naive about how deeply woven food ways are into our identities. And in chapter 2 of the book, I try to take the reader on the journey of realizing that, eating animal products is not just this separate thing, right? That comes apart from the other things we do and the other ways that we are. It's actually the way we perform things like family identity and gender identity and class identity and spiritual identity. It's how we mourn and it's how we celebrate and it's how we choose our friends. And, we've all had that moment where we go out to dinner with someone and we see that they didn't like the same food and we're like, there's not going to be a second invitation, right? They're not the same when it comes to our food ways, right? And so Chapter 2 tries to really take people into the depths of those involvements and explain why it's so incredibly hard, right? To imagine foregoing these products that are not just things we like to eat, but things we use to claim identity and authenticity with the people we love most, and things that we eat in order to get those measures of comfort, belonging, security, approval, right? Eating these foods with those people is who we are. And so the idea that it could just be like buying a fake chicken patty instead of a real chicken patty just misses that complexity. And so chapter 2 ends with this conundrum, right? It's like, wow, this is so deeply rooted. You might think, how on earth could we ever get from acknowledging that it's really this hard to actually saying this is a transition that people could willingly and even joyfully make, which is what I'm trying to claim, right? Later on in the book. So that bit about continuity, right, is to say, look, yes, we're making some changes here, but really what we're doing is we're changing in order to stay the same, because most of us also perform who we are through various moral commitments and emotional attachments and belonging to a religious tradition or a spiritual tradition, right? Or a non-religious set of ethical commitments. And what's interesting about going vegan is there are these inner tensions going on that make it both difficult to change and also completely continuous to aspire to change. And what I mean by that is when we actually take a look at these inner complexities, we see, to be emotionally coherent, I need to move in a direction where I'm not feeling one way about the dog who snores at my feet and putting other animals through lives of abject suffering and premature deaths before adolescence because I happen to like the taste of their bodies. That's emotionally incoherent. Most of us don't want to live in a state of emotional incoherence. Or intellectually, right? My religious tradition says I'm here to be a steward of God's creation, or I'm here to exemplify the Buddha's compassion for all creatures. And yet, as I learn more about foodways, I see, yipes, right? There's a big tension between my physical cravings for this and my intellectual commitments to that. So the idea of chapter 3 then is to say, as hard as it might be to see before we put our thinking caps on, we really already have all the beliefs, all the values, all the experiences, all the intellectual commitments that we need. And moreover, we've been working on those since kindergarten, right? They're things that they're not, difficult ideas. They're things we learned when we were knee-high to a grasshopper.
Yeah, there's two things there I want to come back to. So what is this about? We learned it in kindergarten. You talk a bunch about living out kindergarten ethics. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think of kindergarten ethics not as being oversimplified or silly, but being sort of the ground level rules that we need to flourish in the company of other human beings, right? So I'm not coming at this from like consequentialism, deontology, right? This is not a 300 level ethics class. This is like when you go into the classroom on your first day of kindergarten, there are things that the teacher wants to start instilling you. If your parents haven't already started, God bless them, right? And there are things like, let's be curious when the person is talking rather than interrupting or criticizing. Let's be honest about what's going on. If somebody gets hurt, let's tell the truth about what happened. let's be fair when it comes to sharing the glitter markers. We'd all like to have them all the time for every project, but sometimes it's the yellow table's turn, right? These ideas, authenticity, right? Let's be who we say we are. So if we're going to say we want to be a friend to someone, let's show up like a friend, right? On the playground when they skin their knee. So kindergarten ethics is just that set of really basic coping tools that we need in order to create a safe and exciting environment for human flourishing. And it seemed important to me, given what we were just talking about with that establishing continuity. I wanted this to be not some complex, radical animal rights philosophical theory, right? That you have to change everything you ever thought and felt to accommodate. I thought it'd be more compelling to have a starting point that we've all been kind of aspiring to since we were, arguing about who gets the twisty slide next. And that's right why I call it kindergarten ethics, not to demean it, but to say, hey, is there anything more continuous than that life project we started as kids in order to avoid the chaos of rudeness and sadness and bullies having their way and nobody really getting to learn anything or enjoy themselves in a safe environment.
You use this phrase human flourishing just now, and it made me think that maybe we do a good job in building our humans up and teaching them things in kindergarten and around that age around what it's like to be compassionate and all of those things with other humans. But it is also true, and you touch on some of these structures in your book, that we're raised in a context, whether it's religious or cultural, of humans being supreme over other beings. So maybe we're working on, nurturing each other's flourishing, but we've not really been taught to do that with other animals. And in some religions, especially, there's a sense of like other, and you talk about this in the book, other creatures being there to serve us as humans. We've got a kind of supremacy framework, an oppression framework, speciesism, right? That the social construction of that human animal binary, is what you talk about it, and that it functions as a master concept in the logic of white patriarchal supremacy. We're also being taught that, so just as we're being taught the good, nice things in the kindergarten ethics, that is also being taught to us. And that getting rid of that is a harder project, right? Because it's not tapping back into something we've already learned. It's unlearning something.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's learning and it's unlearning both, right? Because it's funny that you should raise that in this precise context, because that's really the unlearning I had to do, even in the process of writing this book, right? I mean, chapters 4, 5, and 6 in the writing was when I sort of realized, oh, right, like what I'm really talking about here is exactly what Jerusha just mentioned, right? Which is we need a concept of creaturely flourishing, not just human flourishing, right? But creaturely flourishing. And then beyond a concept of creaturely flourishing, we need to recognize that there's no such thing as creatures flourishing without this unique matrix of air and water and food and competition and social possibility. And we need environmental justice most foundationally, right? Because no creature can flourish without that earthly home where there's comfort and safety and approval and et cetera. And so I have to shout out, right, my teachers here. That human animal binary piece is all taken directly from the work of Aff and Sil Ko. In fact, I think when you cited it, that was their language that I had quoted, I think. But I learned an enormous amount about the connections between animalization, right, and racialization from reading their work. In particular, right, Afroism is a book of essays that each of them wrote. Some of them are co-written, some of them they wrote individually. But it's a fascinating journey through this interconnectedness between how the word human tends to function and how the word animal tends to function and how we categorize, right? One species versus millions and millions of species, or, right, when it serves the purposes of our oppressive desires, we move fellow human beings down that animalization spectrum, right? And use language to demote and degrade, right, fellow human beings so that we can dispense with them. And I think if I had to name kind of the greatest personal epiphany that I've had on my journey of going vegan, it's precisely that epiphany that Af and Silco helped me to come to, which is, holy smokes, the very idea of animal here is this sort of absurd pre-reflective categorization of differences. That's too philosophical. I mean, I guess you put millions and millions of different types of creatures and different types of subjectivity and different types of flourishing under one category. And when you take a step back and you think about how absurd it is to say, okay, well, human beings are this, and then octopuses and ostriches and orb weavers and orcas are all the same thing. They're animals, right? And you think about that, right? With even just a little bit of remove from the way that that functions in ordinary language. And it's sort of baffling how silly that is. That the term animal could cover the differences that separate an orca from an orb weaver, right? So I'm a human being. I've got all these complex, fancy ethical systems. And luckily, I show up and make sure that we don't treat these underlings in ways that are in conflict with our ethics. And Af and Silco made it possible for me to transcend that, I think, very simplistic, frankly, way of categorizing creaturely flourishing.
You talked about an aha moment there, and there are at least two that I remember from the book where you describe, I think it was your moral and emotional universe converging as a breaking point. And I've heard this elsewhere too from folks, right? Like this was happening to me and I looked down at the chicken leg I was eating and suddenly I saw it as, an animal or a creature that I didn't want to be eating. Or I heard this, I saw that, I ate this. Are there things that we can do, and maybe it's reading this book, where we can prompt these aha moments for ourselves? Or does it just have to happen organically?
That's such a good question. And it gets to the heart of what human experience is like, right? That these moments, at least in my experience, at least when they're happening, they feel like perfectly contingent bolts from the blue, right? There's no predicting them. You're not ready for them, right? They come from out of the blue. In fact, Tom Reagan, the animal rights philosopher, had a word for this. He called it a Damascus Road experience or Damascus experience. And of course, that comes from out of the Christian tradition where Paul, who used to be a persecutor of Christians, is transformed, right, by this experience on the road to Damascus and then becomes this like the lead evangelical, right, to go back to the lead spreader of the good news. And, this is like in the twinkling of an eye, things change. And I think when we're experiencing those things, they feel like a bolt from the blue. But I think retrospectively, we can often see that the pieces were aligning, the experiences were gathering, right? And retrospective vision, they say, is 2020. And in my experience, that's true. In the moment, feels like we can't predict it. But I do think there are things we can do to prepare ourselves for this. And I describe that in Hungry, Beautiful Animals as this process of kind of doing an inner soil amendment, right? Where you ready yourself maybe for some experiences that you're not going to have today or tomorrow or maybe even next week, certainly not over Christmas dinner, right? You're going to make sure that the experiences don't happen until a time when it's more safe and convenient. But by saying to myself, well, maybe I'm not going to make big food changes now, but I'm going to read this book and I'm going to take this other person's journey, or I'm going to watch this documentary film with an open mind, right? Instead of going in defensively, I'm going to sort of hear, what this has to say, or I'm going to listen to this podcast, or when I go out to this restaurant this one time, I'm going to try the plant-based thing. Like what those kinds of things do is they prepare the soil so that when that moment of arrival happens, the seed falls into fertile soil, and then the transformations, right, can issue forth. But I think trying to predict those things, we really just have to sort of, as it were, make ready, because there's just no telling when all those little contingencies gel into this world-shaping thing, right? This experience we'll never forget that raises all the hair on our bodies and gives us goosebumps. I mean, we've all had those moments, and they're really, truly incredible. And it's why we describe them as life-changing, because one day the world looked like this, and the next day the world looks different. What I hope people take away from this narrative is that we can prepare the way for transformation. We don't have to wait, right? And we can prepare the way doing really little things. We can prepare the way expecting less of ourselves than perfection. And I think that's probably, the ultimate message of this book is the joys of going vegan are much too beautiful to make perfection or perfect timing, right? Or this ideal time in your life. You can start reaping these things now by getting on the path and dispensing in advance with the thought that, right, you have to have this transformational moment or else. And it's worth pointing out that the transformational moments you were talking about came after I had been vegan for a while.
If people haven't noticed yet, the listeners, you use the phrase going vegan a lot. It's an active, present verb there, right? It's an ongoing activity. Can you describe that terminology and I'm guessing your intentionality in using it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I came into discussions of this as a philosopher. We always talk about veganism and what are the defenses of veganism, and are we obligated to adopt veganism? And so I came into this discussion thinking, in the way philosophers often do, is this a defensible, right, set of commitments or something like this? Very obligation focused, very focused on who's in and who's out. There's kind of this list of things that you need to do in order to qualify. And then if you do any of the things you're not supposed to do, it's like your vegan card is revoked, right? And I think isms often feel this way. I mean, most people I know don't find isms super inviting, right? They're really, even when they're welcoming, it sort of feels like it's about identity, who's in and who's out. And what I love about the idea of going vegan is that it's not about identity at all. It's about aspirational activity, right? So going vegan says, hey, look at this beautiful vision of a world where everybody gets a shot at flourishing that is appropriate to the kind of creature they are. It's a beautiful thing to consider. And in light of that vision, what are some daily practices that we could take imperfectly, we realize, to move in the direction of that beautiful vision of a world where creaturely flourishing is abundant, where everybody gets to be who they are. And so when you think of this set of ideas as a journey, right, that unfolds differently for every person, rather than a one-size-fits-all ism that has this list of things that either, right, brings you into that identity or revokes that identity from you. There's just, for me anyway, so much more freedom involved in that. And I don't know how it works for you, Jerusha, but I'm definitely one of those people who's like, when you tell me I can't do something, I don't know. Like I'm anti-authoritarian. I like to be in charge, and so if somebody comes along and they've got an obligation-based framework and it feels like a really big ask, this just makes me want to do it more. when it's coming from that space of obligation, it just feels like a burden. But when you take the weight of the world off your shoulders and you say, wow, look at this world that I could live toward by taking on some of these practices. And I can live toward that vision by doing these practices. And even when I screw up, I don't lose anything. I don't lose an identity. I don't become tainted, because it's not an identity that is the purpose or goal here, right? It's not about arriving anywhere. It's about striving incrementally in the specialized, unique ways that our talents and gifts allow us to do, while forgiving ourselves, right, for the mistakes, and anticipating and even welcoming the backsliding or the different rules for the holidays, or when granny's on the smoker, maybe you eat that taco that you wouldn't eat on the average Tuesday, right? It's like, I want to live in a world where going vegan doesn't depend on, this obligation to quit doing this terrible stuff once and for all, because nobody's going to sign up for that, for one thing. But for another thing, it just completely obscures how joyful it is to make a free decision to prioritize these opportunities, right? I want to be more personally healthful. I want less inflammation in my body. I want to be more emotionally coherent. I don't want to feel one way about my dog and another way about all these other creatures whose suffering I have to ignore in order to look at myself in the mirror. I don't want to be, socially dishonest and inauthentic, where, right, I say that I'm committed to justice, but I'm propping up a system that disenfranchises people who are already on the margins by forcing them to do labor that involves ignoring cries for mercy hundreds and thousands of times a day, because, right, I'm all for social justice when it doesn't cost me that pork chop. I mean, these are beautiful opportunities when you frame them as, in terms of practicing daily exercises that move us in the direction of the beautiful vision. Kick perfectionism to the curb, focus on the opportunities.
So speaking of that beautiful vision, we've got joyful in the title here. And meanwhile, I have you, talking about human suffering and animal suffering. No, let's get to the joy. You have a focus in your writing in this book on kind of the visceral pleasure and abundance that can come with going vegan and eating as a vegan, of starting rather than stopping. I mean, how many philosophy books end with a tiramisu recipe, right? Like this might be the first one, might be the only one. I love it. So can you talk about the role of pleasure and, joy in this new way of eating, but also, as you've described, it's a way of interacting with the world, but it's also about eating.
Yeah, so I think it all gets back to the way that our food ways are just so fundamentally shot through who we are, right? And so there's a lot of ways in which what we eat is affecting us, whether we realize it or not, whether we like it or not. And a lot of times with the standard American diet, the way that our food ways affect us are sad, right? So they create these really complicated inner conflicts where our intellectual commitments and our moral commitments are way out of whack, right? So intellectually, we're always looking for the evidence that human beings are superior, but morally, we know the best arguments suggest that we should be caring about members of other species too. Emotionally, we know that it's weird that Gus, our bulldog snoring at our feet, gets treated to a Christmas stocking while the animals we're eating do not. Over time, living in that, what I call kind of inner disarray, right? Where there's this really there's a lot of estrangement between and among the different members of our inner family, right? Our physical, social, emotional, intellectual, and moral parts, if you will, are not right working together well. And in order to disguise that they're not working together well, we have all these defense mechanisms and forms of dishonesty and inauthenticity that we resort to. And in my experience, that kind of inner turpitude leads to a lot of anxiety, a lot of sadness, right? We often don't realize what the sources of that are. But what going vegan does in this way, like frankly, Jerusha, no other practice. I mean, I study practices for flourishing for a living. That's what my teaching revolves around. I have never found a bigger joy aggregator than the practice of going vegan. The way that going vegan brings together the best parts of each member of that inner family, right? I mean, I just think if you go down the line, like intellectually, right, what science teaches us about members of other species, what science teaches us about what our earth needs to bounce back from, what the Industrial Revolution and its aftermath have caused, what science teaches us about inflammation and diseases of affluence. Our intellectual commitments line up beautifully with the idea that going vegan is the right thing to do. Our moral commitments, same story, right? Our emotional commitments, same story. And so instead of fighting all these inner battles and using all these defense mechanisms and forms of inauthenticity that really lead to, in my experience anyway, languishing. We're not happy. We're not fulfilled. We don't have a sense of being on an incremental journey into something beautiful. Often we feel deeply in despair, right, about these things. And so the joy of having this intentional practice that literally every time you sit down to a meal, you're radiating love for other sentient beings, radiating love and support for workers to have alternatives to those jobs that are terrible, right? Radiating love into your own inner family, right? Saying to the inner parts of yourself, you don't have to come up with all these weird ways of trying to cope with how out of whack the inner family is, because now, right, all of that inner turpitude is being replaced by alignment, right? And inner resonance with these broader things that we're concerned about. And then, right, if all this sounds too heady, the explosion of beautiful things to eat that happen when you move away from like the hockey puck sized dead animal body, right? The oversauced, overcooked vegetables and the starchy, salty stuff, right? I mean, that's kind of the standard American diet is some iteration of that. And when you move away from that into this profusion of ways to eat fruits and nuts and plants and legumes, and I mean, my cooking life, my food life is so much more diverse and exciting now than it ever was before I went vegan. And just also the ingenuity. Jerusha, I love so much when my friend says something like, oh, well, you can't have this. Well, it took me 20 years to perfect it, but I have a tiramisu recipe that will blow your friends and family away, right? And having the ingenuity and the gumption and the joy to sort of say, we can do this another way. And then to experience the delight that comes from taking a bite of that and having the whole inner family in alignment, right? That this is not the product of someone's stolen labor, broken body, earthly destruction, rainforest, right? Clearing. All of that inner strife feels different, hits different when you're eating foods that radiate love rather than strife. into the world. I sound a little more woo-woo. The philosopher in me is sort of like, you might want to take a second stab at but it's true. This is my experience. It's maybe I should reframe. It's true to my experience. The joy, the joy aggregation of being right in resonance with all those members of my inner family, the growth into understanding things that I didn't ever really reflect on before, and coming into what seems to me to be a much more mature and loving relationship with myself and the world outside. Man, that gives me a lot of satisfaction. It just feels really, really good experientially to have this big piece of our lives, something we spend so much time and money and social engagement on, right? Food, to not have all these, right, asterisks that cut so deeply against the grain of who we want to be when we're at our best.
The way that you talk about this really calls to our best selves and really assumes that we each have a best self. And it fills me with optimism. But then I remember that I'm a pessimist. And then I remember this moment in time that we're in. And it might be that you don't see your role, and I would appreciate this if this was your answer, but it might be that you don't see your role as having to engage with some of this, and that really you're there to cheer us on and cheer on our best selves. But I'm thinking about, like, this week there was a New York Times opinion piece that was called "Sorry, but This is the Future of Food." I don't know if you saw that.
And basically, I did, yes.
No one wants to give up eating meat, as we can plainly see by the rising meat consumption rates. So guess we're going to need to produce as much meat as possible and do it in this way that is awful for workers, for the land, for animals, whatever. But it really delivers a lot of calories via meat, which everybody loves. So let's keep going with it. Or just, I would say that there's a political moment and a social moment happening right now that is, I don't think really calls to our best selves. That is very much, we as individuals deserve everything. We as a country deserve more. Maybe we as men deserve more. We as white men deserve everything, whatever we want, a big steak, a side of, a rack of ribs or whatever it is. It makes me nervous about a philosophy that calls for us to tap into our best selves, because I don't see that much of people tapping into their best selves right now. Can you inspire me?
Yeah, I don't know. The first thing I need to do is just acknowledge that difficulty. I mean, I cried, when I thought about having to launch a book about joy on November 12th, right? I mean, without saying too much, right? I mean, it's a hard time to blow sunshine up people's wazoos, right? And that is not at all what I want this book to do. And I'll say, right, I mean, a lot of my heroes in this movement, a lot of the people whose books are the giant's shoulders I'm standing on. For instance, right, Carol J. Adams, The Sexual Politics of Meat, one of my heroes, one of my mentors, one of my friends. And this book celebrated its 35th anniversary. For anyone who hasn't read it, drop everything and read it. It's one of the most transformational books. That, and also Living Among Meat Eaters. Those two books, if I were made of money, I'd say I'd buy them for anyone who emails me, because they're just that good. Unfortunately, I'm not made of money, so I apologize to your listeners, but they are that good. If you can find a way to get a hold of a copy, get a hold of a copy. But it's incredibly depressing that book is more relevant now, 35 years after it was written. Because, of course, what we wanted is for everybody to wake up when The Sexual Politics of Meat hit the bookshelf, and for us to have worked through this problem. And so I am acutely aware that, especially being like the white guy who's like, smile, it can still be joyful, right? This is a bad look. It's not the look that I was counting on when I signed the contract to write this book in 2021. So it's not lost on me, Jerusha, that the timing is hard. Having said that, I can't help but wonder if, and again, I'm not one to look for silver linings. This is not who I am at all. In fact, I think I'm, I've been influenced a lot by pessimist traditions, Afro pessimism, um, and a lot of the insights that drive my book are things I learned from Black vegans, right? So, including the things that I think are deeply joyful. And so maybe that is the answer here, right? That in a world full of oppression, there is and there can still be joy. In a world full of oppression, there has to be laughter in the face of the farcical white male supremacy that we're forced to put up with in the news. There have to be joyful repudiations, right, of the silliness and infantile ways that we're seeing, right, the revenge, or the imagined revenge, right, of cultural awakenings that were long overdue around sexism and racism and these sorts of things. We can't just say, well, now we have to live under this boot and never laugh again, or now we have to give up on the prospect of inner freedom, which in my view becomes even more important when there's a boot on our neck, right? To feel as though that inner family has a chance at joy no matter what the circumstances are outside. And so I guess, and this might just be woefully naive. I mean, you asked me to inspire you, so doggone it, I'm trying, right? But it seems to me joy becomes more important when oppression rears its ugly head. We have to have tools to do the work of joy in our small day-to-day spheres that, with luck, don't have to be completely colonized by oppression and evil, right? And that's a tall order, and I'm not going to lie, it's much harder for some people than it is for others to keep their spheres, right, uncolonized. And so the last thing I want to do as a white man at this moment in history is to say, let's all just smile. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, even in the face of oppressive systems, we have it within us to laugh. We have it within us to expect more of ourselves. We have it within us to work on inner alignment, even when outer alignment is impossible. And strangely, mystically even, in my experience, when that inner alignment happens, we often find ways to show up in the face of oppression in surprising and inspiring ways that are transformational. But when we let that inner work go, when we give up on inner joy, when we can't find a way to laugh, when dour, austere, right, criticism with no joyful purpose becomes the norm, we die inside and our power diminishes. And I guess my hope is, did I want Hungry Beautiful Animals to come out at this moment? No. But I hope that it can be for those who choose to take it up. And I would understand somebody saying, nope, not going for Smiley at this moment. And I respect, right? I get that critique. And there are parts of me who are like, I feel the same way about my own book in this moment. But for those who, make that choice to say, I want to look for joy, I'd like to try to find some inspiration. Let's see if we can pull, right? I was going to say pull a rabbit from a hat, but let's not go there, right? On a podcast about expanded animal consciousness, whatever the beautiful, perfect vegan equivalent of pulling a rabbit from a hat is, right? When it comes to finding joy in a moment of despair. Maybe Hungry Beautiful Animals can be a part of that story. And a big part of what I'm trying to do is encourage people to find power in small spaces, right? To find power where they have influence rather than taking the weight of the world on their shoulders, which, let's be honest, is a recipe for despair, right? Like, none of us is big enough to face down the oppressive age we're living in and do anything about it. And if we judge ourselves by that standard, oh gosh, I can't believe I managed not to get the American electorate to do what I wanted it to do. If that's the standard for success, we'll all be miserable. But if the standard for success is doing that inner soil amendment so that we can show up with joy and be a leavening agent in a world that desperately needs flourishing in the face of all this suffering, well, I think that's worth trying to do on this micro scale, even when the systems are against us.
Absolutely. You succeeded in inspiring, by the way. And I was thinking, even if you didn't, that I could just eat my feelings with like a big vat of excellent vegan tiramisu, and that you would have at least given me that. That would have been enough. What You're Eating is produced by Nathan Dalton and foodprint.org, which is a project of the Grace Communications Foundation. Special thanks to Matt Halteman. You can find us at www.foodprint.org, where we have this podcast as well as articles, reports, a food label guide, and more.